So please, Abiodun, please go ahead.
Excellent. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on the part of the world that you're joining us from. One of the good things about the world in which we live nowadays is because of the power of technology, we can do things across time zones seamlessly without any hitches in the experience. My name is Abiodun Egbetokun. I'm the moderator for this afternoon's session, and it's a pleasure to have you here with us. I got my PhD in 2010 from Friedrich Schiller University in Germany, which happens to be one of the strong centers on evolutionary economics and studies of competence building systems under the supervision of Professor Uwe Kantner. And during the program, we had, great people like Paul Nightingale himself, Giovanni Dozzi, and several others visiting. So I usually am proud to say that I learned from the best. And I'm happy to be moderating this session today, where one of the best, some of the most respected scholars that I know are going to be speaking. The Consortium for Research on Innovation Studies, which are the organizers of this program, is a voluntary online activity that was started about 3 years ago, in 2021, by a group of early career researchers, 100% alumni of the Global Hicks competence building programs, the academy, and several other interventions. We have as our patron the very well-known Professor Mendonca. We started with a lecture series on innovation systems to mark the centenary birthday of the late Christopher Freeman. And due to popular demand, we've had to continue beyond then because of the depth and the richness of the conversations that ensued. And anyone who has followed between then and now would, can bear witness that the discussions have always been very impactful and very insightful. We subsequently ran several series for the benefit of early career researchers in innovation studies, especially those from the Global South, where opportunities for competence building are limited and scholastic opportunities are few and far between. I do remember speaking on, I think it was the 11th of the lecture series, talking about some empirical analysis of innovation using innovation data. The In Conversation series itself was started with the specific objective of taking record of the intellectual biographies of very well-known innovation scholars. And we do believe that this is a fundamental learning material for students, and it's also a very nice way to keep the records for the archives, beyond what can be written down. Fluidic conversations as we have in this series are very, very useful. The first of the events featured our own Professor Richard Nelson, who was interviewed by Professor Franco Malaba on the 13th of December, 3 years ago, 2021. And today, our time flies, is the 18th event in this series. And Professor Ben Martin will be interviewed by Professor Sandro Mendonça. These events are all meticulously documented, and the videos are available free of charge on our website, cris-is.org. That's CRIS-is.org if you want to check. We do this on a pro bono basis with no funding from anywhere as of now. The Zoom platform itself and the website have been supported by University of Malaya North-South Research Center, that's UMNSRC. And we thank Professor Angateva Bhaskaran, for providing support, and Professor Mamumuchi of Tshwane University of Technology in South Africa. I know that many people in this audience would know these two names. We thank them for the kind gesture of supporting the documentation on the website and the Zoom link that we're using. So today's event will run for 2 hours, and we have two distinct halves. In the first half, Ben Martin will be interviewed by Sandro Mendonça. I'm calling that an interview, but it's more like a conversation between the two of them for about 55 minutes, and then we'll have a 5-minute break, and then there will be a 45-minute panel discussion also involving Sandro, Ben, and three other erudite scholars who will be introduced later. And then the floor will open for questions and answers from the audience about 15 minutes before 3 o'clock. So I would encourage you in the audience to please type in your well-framed questions in the chat box. We'll pick them up and come upon you when the occasion arises. So we would ask that you be brief and straight to the point. And please, throughout the entire proceedings today, keep your microphones in silent mode so that we can all have a seamless and smooth experience. So having said that, I would hand over to Sandro Mendonca, who is going to coordinate the rest of the session today. So Sandro, over to you.
Thank you so much, Abiodun. And I also thank Rajesh. I thank in your persons this incredible environment and the platform for helping us out to focus on what we love best in terms of our profession, which is talking about innovation, science policy, and technical change. And it was in my interest then in the late 90s that I approached SPRU to study there, first as a master's. Then I was able to meet Ben. Ben was director of SPRU at that time, and then I was lucky to be one of Ben's research students for my doctorate. And through all these years, I was a witness of the abilities of Ben to engage in a number of important conversations and debates in our field. And I would like just to ask Ben about how he himself entered the field. So, Ben, maybe if you could place us in the 70s, you having a trajectory from Cambridge and knowing that circle of scholars and coming from the art sciences, how did you come about being interested in landing in a red brick university down south, where the university circle was very known for its counterculture feeling? So I wonder what in your character led you to the topic, to the approach, and to the place.
Okay, well, let me begin by thanking the organisers for these events, which I think are a great initiative, enabling people from all around the world, particularly younger researchers, to find out not just what people have done in the past, but why they did it. And in your case, Sandro, how did I come into this? So that's the starting point here. In 1970, I went up to Cambridge to study natural sciences and specialise in physics. During that time, though, certainly for the first 2 years, I had a rule that I would spend at least half the time doing non-physics stuff. And each term I'd try and find something new. This was a time when students were protesting. We were also very idealistic. And one of the themes I got interested in was what went under the rubric then of science and society. And the fundamental question was science being used for the full benefit of humanity? And nobody seemed to have an answer, but I used to duck out of physics lectures and go and listen to economists, to sociologists, and others to find out more about the relationship between science and society. At the end of the 3 years, I then had a dilemma. Should I stay in physics and do a PhD it would have been in radio astronomy, or should I begin this move towards this territory which I knew as science and society? In fact, rather than try and answer that in that final year where lots of things were going on, I was studying for final exams, I was graduating, I was getting married, I delayed the decision for 2 years, and my wife and I went off for 2 years as volunteers in Africa, where we served as secondary school teachers. In the meantime, I'd opened up a number of options and told each of them, I won't decide it for a year, and then I'll give you 1 year's notice to stand down that position. I'm not taking it up. And in that first year in Nigeria, I made the decision that if I was going to move away from science, it was the time to do it as a graduate student rather than try and do it later. So I took up the offer to go to Manchester, which was one of the 3 places that had offered me a place in something to do with science and society, where I did a master's in the structure and organization of science and technology. And amongst other things, that broadened me out. So all the gaps that I felt in my educational background began to be filled, bit of history, philosophy, sociology, politics, management, and so on, in order to study the relationship between science and society. I then, having done the master's, began the doctoral work, but after a year, saw an advert for a research fellowship at SPRU. Initially thought it's much too soon. I've only been doing a doctorate for 1 year. But a fellow student suggested I look again. And I thought, well, maybe if I apply, I'll get some interview experience and also perhaps get my name known at SPRU. By then, I knew that was at the forefront of this field. So I went down there for the interview with nothing to lose, thinking I didn't stand a chance. And lo and behold, they then offered me a job. So I then had to stop doing the doctoral work and move to SPRU. So that's how I got into it. SPRU by then, as I say, I'd identified as the best place along with Manchester for doing this sort of work. And as they offered me the fellowship, that's where I went. It also fitted in with my wife's plan, who is now in the early stages of a career in management in the health service, and she got a job in a London hospital. So that's how I ended up in SPRU in 1978.
So we can see, Ben, that you have this intellectual drive, this curiosity, but also this need to link up with the real world, and not necessarily the most comfortable geographies for somebody that has not been outside the island or Europe. And some of us also know that we want to do a doctoral work, and then we are interrupted by things of life, and things are not linear. Now, let me ask you about the first clash with reality. So research, you do it, but then you can have a backlash. I do remember, Ben, talking with Chris Freeman, and he was saying, oh, look, Ben was tough. He had to withstand lots of criticism because of his early work published in research policy having to do with basic research being made in very posh universities, and now being assessed by some new approaches that were quantitative, that had to do with the scientific and influential footprint of these institutions. Now, tell us, share around what is like to all of a sudden feel the heat and the surprise that good research can give you in terms of understanding that the world of knowledge is populated by interests.
Okay, well, first I should give a background to the project that I was hired for in SPRU in 1978. And the background is SPRU was set up in 1966. It had a 10-year review in 1976, which said SPRU had been doing great, but actually it wasn't doing anything on science policy. It was doing innovation studies, basically, technology and innovation. So in around 77, 78, they made a proposal for a study of Britain's investment in big science labs. At that time, the leading or the largest research council, the Science Research Council, devoted a very large proportion of its funding to 5 or 6 big centres. And so the project was set up to assess what did Britain get from its very sizable investment in those big science centres. There were 2 in particle physics, 2 in radio astronomy, and 1 in optical astronomy. So that was the background to the project. In those days, decisions were made by scientists, by the great and the good, behind closed doors. And if you ask them how they did it, they'd say peer review. Well, peer review may work reasonably well within an area where you've got lots of peers who you can go to. But it doesn't work when you want to compare one field with another, because all peers will say their field is the most important, otherwise they wouldn't be working in it. And it doesn't work in areas of big science where you have clashing interests. So you work at one big science lab, and if another lab puts in a proposal for funding and you're asked to review it, if you say yes, that's less money for you. If you say no, that's more money left in the pot for you. So we had a feeling that science policy wasn't working very well. Indeed, there were government reports saying there's no real solid base to decisions being made about science and science funding. So that was the background to the study. So off we went to these 5 centres. We compared with the nearest equivalents we could find elsewhere in Europe and North America. That was our approach, international comparative approach. And we looked at 3 dimensions: their scientific contributions, their economic contributions, and their technological contributions. And we devised methods for doing all of this. We were amongst the pioneers for assessing large scientific labs. We came back with the results showing that some of the labs had done very well. In particular, the Cambridge Radio Astronomy Observatory was one of the world leaders, if not the world leader at that time. Others were doing less well, like the Jodrell Bank Radio Astronomy Observatory, which had been a world leader in the 50s and 60s, but which had since been overtaken. We published our results, or we wrote up our results, and of course the director of Jodrell Bank, Sir Bernard Lovell, did not like the world being told that his lab was now slipping. I should say this was on the basis not only of various indicators, publications, citations, but also on the basis of peer review at Jodrell Bank and at other radio astronomy labs around the world. And indeed, some of the staff at Jodrell Bank knew that things were not going well and that they needed to make changes. But Sir Bernard Lovell didn't like the results. He then sued or threatened to sue the publisher of research policy, which was then North Holland, with a case for libel. Research policy and North Holland hadn't had anything like this before. They had to hire a barrister who specialized in libel law. We very carefully were taken through our text, and there were a few cases where we had used absolute adjectives rather than relative ones. So you could say Jodrell Bank had done less well than the others. You couldn't say Jodrell Bank had done badly. So we changed half a dozen adjectives, and then the thing was eventually published, but it had been delayed by a year or more. So, and at that stage, there was a lot of hostility from the scientific establishment, because here we were, a bunch of what they saw as social scientists coming along saying that they hadn't been doing a very good job with running science and that we needed to open it up to indicators and extensive peer review and so on, and do things a bit differently. Hence, there was a lot of opposition in the first few years, which we ran into, but that over time began to subside as the scientists began to realize that actually some of our results could help them make a case for increased funding.
So basically, you made your name in this science policy research assessment field to start with. You became very well known, maybe not for the best reasons, in the community of science decision makers, university guardians in Britain and elsewhere. But along the way, you were forced to stress test your approaches. So one thing that the student learned from that early ventures of yours and your colleagues is the notion of partial indicators, which you maybe could elaborate a little bit, because this sounds very Sprue style: humble, empirical, practical, but consequential. And the other idea is that, yes, you have big science, but then you started to inquire more deeply into big science. And it's not only pure science. This big science is basic. We can see this, goes to the fundamentals of some area, but there is a pure side to it, but there is also a strategic side to it. So eventually that may feed into some great social, political goals. So Ben, maybe if you take us to the world in which Sprue is an entrepreneurial place for partial indicators, and then how is it that research may be guided towards some more tangible projects of society?
Well, let's take the partial indicators as a starting point there. As I say, we were, along with Fran Narin in the States, who was doing work on assessing research. In fact, he started a few years ahead of us working with the National Institutes of Health. But we and Fran were the pioneers in this field of how do you evaluate research in a more empirical and even quantitative way. We were, in fact, from my doctoral work, which wasn't completed, I was already familiar with bibliometric indicators. I'd started to use them in a very amateurish way. And we saw some potential here, but we also were very careful, and this, if you like, was the SPRU training, about how we tried to apply these. So if you take citations, there was already some people saying citations are a measure of quality. And we were saying no, and indeed there were papers written about this. No, they're not a measure of quality. They are at best an indicator, and not even of quality, but of the impact of a particular publication on that academic community. But citations are also influenced by a whole range of other factors. In other words, they are a very imperfect indicator, a very imperfect measure of what the concept you're trying to measure. So the very first paper, or the important paper that we wrote on radio astronomy, the first half is conceptual. What do these indicators actually capture, and what is the broader method of converging partial indicators? So there's a long discussion about what publication counts or citation counts do and do not measure, and all the caveats that should be applied. Namely, they should only be applied to larger aggregations of researchers, such as labs or countries. They shouldn't be applied to individuals. These are all parts of the footnotes we put in our paper, although many have since forgotten all of that. So we put together that approach along with, as I say, extensive peer review. We interviewed hundreds of big scientists in high-energy physics, radio astronomy, optical astronomy all around the world, and asked them to rank how well different accelerators or telescopes had done, and then compared those results with what was coming out of the bibliometric analysis. And by and large, they converged. Sometimes they didn't, and then you had to investigate further and find why they did not converge. So, for example, there was some early work done at Fermilab, the big high-energy physics lab in the US, where they thought they discovered new particles and then subsequently got better data and it all went away. Well, those early papers were very highly cited at the time because they threatened to change the underpinning theory, but after 6 months they went away. So this is where you had to look more closely if the bibliometric indicators did not coincide with what the extensive peer review was doing. So that was the method that we set out. And in that, we were very much guided by Keith Pavitt, Chris Freeman, Roy Rothwell, and others who had experience with indicators in other areas and knew exactly what these problems were. When we came to write it all up, I do remember it as a bit of a crisis of confidence. I wanted to use this terminology of partial indicators, but was aware it was a bit of a tautology. The notion of an indicator already implies it's an imperfect measure. So should we stick partial in front of it? And I remember I went to my mentor at the time, Marie Yehoda, and said, look, I'm not sure about this. And she said, no, go for it. You know, that's a phrase which will stick in people's minds. If you just use indicators, it won't. But if you call it converging partial indicators, that's a phrase that will help this idea fly. And she was absolutely right. So there's a little lesson there for early work where you're trying to make a name for yourself, come up with some phrase that is likely to get some traction. And that's what we duly did there.
Yeah, and then about strategic research as another area that became very associated with your own name. And if you allow me, let me just link these ideas. So you have now unpacked big science. We know it's basic, pure, but also strategic. And there is also this idea of priority setting. And this is just before, Ben, that we go to the turn to the 90s, and I will ask you about how do you handle coexistence with political power. So that will be in our horizon just around the corner in our conversation. But now, strategic research priority setting. This is not pedestrian and analytical work. Now it's much more encompassing, and it's going to the long run of resource allocation purposes.
Well, yes, the notion of strategic research is another concept to which I and others at SPRU made, I think, quite important contributions. Have to go back to the 50s. In those days, there was a dichotomy for research. It was either basic or it was applied. In fact, for basic, there are also alternative terms, pure, fundamental, whatever. They got all the nice adjectives, and the people in applied research, they were just the rest who were applied. And indeed, that was encapsulated in the Frascati manual, in which Chris Freeman was involved, setting up definitions for constructing data on funding and research, what was basic and what was applied. So all of that was accepted at the time, but there was a growing realization there was a lot of activity going on somewhere in between the more fundamental basic research and the more applied research, and we didn't really have a proper term for it. When we came to do our first book on foresight, we said, actually, in talking about foresight, we're very much talking about how to identify areas of research that are likely to lead to major economic and social benefits. And that, by and large, is work that's somewhere in between traditional basic and traditional applied. So we began to come up with definitions for strategic research as a sideline for that book on foresight in 1984. And indeed, subsequently, many people cited that book not because of foresight, but because of the discussion of what is strategic research. Most prominently, Ari Rip, who was for many years prominent working at the intersection between our field, science policy, and our neighbours in science and technology studies. He often credited us with helping to formalise this definition of what we meant by strategic research. Later, that area was given different names. It was called Pasteur's Quadrant by Donald Stokes, and his terminology had very big political implications in the States in terms of funding prospects. Before he talked about Pasteur's Quadrant, research in the States was very much a political football. The Democrats would be willing to fund a lot of more applied research, and then the Republicans would come back into power and say, no, we mustn't fund applied research because that's corporate welfare, we'll cut it all out. But when Stokes came along with his terminology of Pasteur's Quadrant, which is very much strategic research, suddenly Republicans thought, that's okay for federal government to fund. And so it had big financial implications. So all of this shows that terminology is politically and economically important. That's one of the lessons I learned from all of this. And as I say, that was part of the work on foresight, which is, I think, is where you were heading with the next question.
Yes, indeed. So we are just arriving to the glorious 90s. The world is changing. So walls are coming down. Markets are becoming flat, they would say soon in the US. And as I meet you in the end of the decade, you are a big shot in a number of ways, including foresight, and you are in the know regarding people in power in London, in institutions. So can you share how that happened? Because you in the early 80s, you are a power repellent. So people in power want to crush you. But one decade is over, another comes, and now your approach is a darling. You have a proven track record. You withstood battles, and people now in London that call the priorities for science, but also industrial development. Now they are looking at you. What I'm going at is what is now the feeling of being able to inject your opinions in the corridors, is to shape a policy not only with the big concepts that you have already supplied the community, but now this coexistence with people that are a different breed. So these people are full of passions, interests again, and now you are still having the heft of academia.
Well, how did we get to that? The answer is after a lot of setbacks and learning from failure and being prepared for opportunities and taking them when they came along. So that's the short answer. Let me expand on that. So in 83, 84, we were asked by ACARD, the Advisory Council on Applied Research and Development in the UK, how could Britain identify better exploitable areas of science? So exploitable areas of science is very much what we came to call strategic research. It wasn't a very big study. We went to France, Germany, US, and Japan and looked at how government and companies set about identifying exploitable areas of science. We wrote it all up and basically said Japan is the world leader here, both in terms of government exercises, but also company exercises. We should learn from them and try a small-scale foresight experiment in the UK. So that was the punchline of our 1984 report to ACARD and the book that we published in that year. However, this was not the right time to suggest that to the British government. 1984, we were at the height of Thatcherism. Mrs. Thatcher, I think, had just won her second election and was very much into reducing the role of government and the state and letting the market take over for as much as they could. So here we were coming along from Sprue, which already had a somewhat troubled reputation. Keith Pavitt was called a traitor by the chief engineer at the Department of Trade and Industry for daring to suggest that we got wrong policies and poor management in British firms. Here we were coming along suggesting a new role for government to launch some sort of foresight exercise. So that study had zero impact. But we learned from that. In fact, one of the things we got wrong was the subtitle to our book, Foresight in Science. We were trying to think of a catchy subtitle. I remember going around the Old Mantell building in Sprue with half a dozen possibilities. And the one people liked was Picking the Winners. So that book was called Foresight in Science, Picking the Winners. That was precisely the wrong thing to say to Mrs. Thatcher. She said, governments don't pick winners. You leave it to the market to pick winners. Actually, we should have called it Identifying the Areas Where, British companies have the best prospects, but that would have been too long and complicated as a subtitle. So that was one thing we got wrong. In addition, we said, well, you should learn from the Japanese, and many in British government felt no, Japan was very different, and what worked in Japan wouldn't work in the UK. That was their argument. And so, we learned what we'd done wrong there. We then took advantage of an opportunity in 87 when the Dutch government came looking for advice on foresight, and we did a much more detailed, more academic study for them. It's a pleasure working for Dutch civil servants who really got engaged in what this was all about. Wrote our second book on it, and that led to the Dutch government, in fact, two ministries in the Netherlands setting up foresight exercises in a sort of competition between them. Then in 93, I think it was, or 92, I get a phone call from somebody at the Cabinet Office who I'd met at an OECD conference a few months earlier, where I'd actually been quite rude about something that was being presented. He'd obviously made note of that. He called me up and said, the British government would like a study in foresight. Are you willing to do it? And I said, I'm willing to do it. Is the government willing to listen? And he said, yes, we have a different Prime Minister, John Major, a different ideology in which government intervention in industrial policy and innovation policy is now acceptable. So I did the study. By then, unfortunately, John Irvin had left. So it was largely me. And this time made deliberate efforts to tailor the message so that it would be more acceptable to a right of centre government. That was one thing I'd learned. You can't just design a better mousetrap. You've got to present it in a way that takes account of the political context in which you're trying to launch this message. And so the arguments were couched in terms of, identifying emerging generic technologies and setting out an argument as to why government should be involved in that, why you couldn't leave it all to the market. I wrote my 50-page report and was then told, well, ministers don't read 50 pages. We want a 2-page summary, which took as long to write as the 50-page report. And then off to present that to the minister, William Waldegrave, who was in charge of science at the time. Also present was the junior minister, Robert Jackson. So I was given a few minutes to present this 2-minute brief. Robert Jackson, William Waldegrave basically said, that's a great idea. Robert Jackson said, this is a crazy idea. Why do we have to spend $1 million? Because they'd asked me for cost. And I said, oh, maybe about £1 million. I plucked a figure out of the air. Robert Jackson said, why do we have to spend £1 million? Can't we just go and buy the Japanese foresight report and apply that in the UK? And I had to explain why that might not be a good idea. And at the end of the meeting, the government chief scientist, Bill Stewart, took me and the civil servant who'd hired me off to his office and said, well done. And I said, well, why are you congratulating me? You know, there's a big argument here between the two ministers. And he said, no, the more that Jackson's against it, the more that Waldegrave will be in favour of it because they hate each other's guts. So this is where you begin to learn. It's important to know about the political context if you're trying to deliver messages. And lo and behold, a few months later, out comes the white paper. And although much of it is rearranging deck chairs, rearranging research councils, the big new idea that Waldegrave wants to put in this is technology foresight. Basically, we've sold it to him. He then claims it's his idea at that meeting. And I've been an advocate of, or a devotee rather, of a series of British programs called Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister. So at that point, I knew you didn't say, no, Minister, that's not your idea. We told you about this 10 years ago. You say, yes, Minister, what a brilliant idea. And have you thought about doing it this way or that way? So they think it's basically their idea. So that's another thing I'd learned along the way, this time from a TV program.
That is great. And one idea that you also are able to deliver to the field, if I may say, to the foresight field, is the role of foresight in wiring up the national system of innovation, which is a beautiful way to connect two separate but very complementary areas that are of our concern. But if now I can change gears, when I met you in the late 90s, you were the SPRU director. I wonder how was it to wire up SPRU at that point? You had new young people. You had the golden oldies, Chris, Keith, Nick. You had some new arrivals like Ed Steinmuller. You had Anders Sterling up and coming. You have lots of people. I'm just talking about names that for me were more familiar as I meet SPRU. But now you understand the power dynamics in Whitehall and the big research institutions in Britain. But what is now your experience as a manager of a research institution in which everybody is very brilliant, everybody is very autonomous? How do you do that in a time of transition in which we are now going to be in the early 2000s, and there is a change of atmosphere, there is a change of technology, different ways to cooperate, different role for journals. But maybe we can start off with the lessons from having such an institution in times of change, SPRU, very independent inside a red brick university.
Okay, well, I was fortunate. First of all, I had been part of SPRU under 3 directors, Chris Freeman, Jeff Oldham, Mike Gibbons. I'd seen how different styles of leadership had worked. So that gave me some ideas. I must say, when I was appointed, there was a bit of mild panic, to put it mildly. And indeed, what I did was ask Keith Pavitt to serve as acting director for about 3 months while I went off visiting the nearest equivalents to SPRU in Europe and North America. So in Scandinavia, Holland, Germany, France, US, and so on. Learning how they ran their organizations, what the problems, how they tried to confront them, and so on. So I came back with a set of ideas, which was actually quite important. In addition, I realized, apart from having been director of graduate studies, I didn't have much management training, so I put myself on lots of courses. There was an individual at Lancaster University, whose name I've forgotten, who ran training for higher education managers. And I remember thinking, why are there not more people doing this? There must be lots of people who haven't actually learned any management or leadership, and they just become heads of department or whatever. So I went to probably 6 or 8 of these and actually found that what was the most important bit that I learned was not from the lecturers, but from talking to other people in similar positions who had related issues. Some of them are running centres like SPRU. How did they approach some of the problems that we face? So that was another important resource that I drew upon. I think I was also lucky. Mike Gibbons had he was the first non-SPRU director to be appointed. So he came in, made some major changes, including abolishing the 5 main groups that we'd had for 20 years or so, which caused consternation, to put it mildly. So he'd set in train a number of things, and I'd learned from him. Well, we had some successes, including the new building, which we'll perhaps come to, the Freeman Centre. But there are also difficult times. One group ran out of money, the energy group ran out of money, and its head, John Surrey, retired. Its deputy head, John Cheshire, took early retirement. Steve Thomas went off to Latin America, and we were left with just 1 or 2 people, including Andy Sterling. So that was difficult. And towards the end, we lost a whole group. David Gann and his group decided they were going off to Imperial College. We made them an offer that we could not match with our resources. So there were just turning my phone off, sorry. So, it was an exhilarating time. I had excellent support from colleagues, from Martin Bell, Nick von Tunzelman, Mike Hobday, and others. I think we were a fairly cohesive team. We shared views on how things should be done. We were very well plugged in internationally, so we kept seeing how other organizations were doing things. So I like to think, we stayed on top and, introduced a number of changes that kept us in a fairly forefront position. But at the end of 8 years, I was beginning to run out of energy. In addition, I knew research had taken a back seat and I wanted to get back to research. So in 2004, I stepped down so that somebody else with new ideas, new perspectives could take over. But unfortunately, that didn't go very well, as we'll perhaps come on to later.
Well, we don't have much time. Maybe in the next half of our experience here. But since you have touched upon leaving the decision-making role at SPRU and the need to think to yourself, what is of my interest now in terms of research. I think this is an interesting turning point because, of course, we have lots of cycles in our lives, and after 8 years, one is exhausted, but one sees the world now in a different way. And you, in the late 2000s, you are busy with a few things. I think you are busy with the whole topic of research integrity. This is probably linked to the fact that information and communication technologies have lowered the threshold for people to test things that perhaps they shouldn't be testing. And you also, as we turn the decade to the 2010s, you also make a big reflection about the future of the field. As we are navigating these times, some of our great mentors pass away. So in the early 2000s, Keith unexpectedly, then later on, Chris, and Nick becomes sick in time. So you in the late 2000s you are dealing with research integrity. This is not much to be expected, checking your track record, right? Why this topic? Why do you bother with this? Why is so important? And then the future of science studies and innovation studies.
Okay. Research integrity, that's one area that I did not deliberately intend to go into. It happened by accident. In 2004, Martin Bell, Nick von Tunzelmann and I took over the Sprue editorship of research policy. As you say, Keith Pavitt had died 2 or 3 years earlier. Chris Freeman had come back from retirement to hold the fort for a couple of years. But in 2004, as I stepped down from director, he said, I can't do it anymore. So the three of us took over. 2007, we're told that one of the papers we published back in 1993 is based on plagiarism. It's about 80% plagiarism of a paper in a marketing journal. We investigate and find this isn't just a one-off moment of madness by the author. He's a serial plagiarist who's got away with plagiarism on numerous previous occasions where people have discovered it and nothing happened. So we take this seriously. We investigate very thoroughly over a 8 or 10 month period. I bring it in Nature to help with the investigation because it gets too big for us to handle on our own. And at the end, we publish an editorial and Nature publishes an expose on the same day, exposing this guy, Hans Werner Göttinger, as a serial plagiarist. So that's how we got involved. After that, I and the other editors of research policy thought we cannot be caught out like this again. We must do all that we can to ensure we don't have future publications that are similarly involving misconduct of one form or another. So that's when we got serious. And since then, I think the academic community realizes that we do take things seriously. And it is why about 10 years later, a case was brought to us by somebody who appeared to be very prolific. In Germany, in business schools, they have the Handelsblatt ranking, not only of business schools, but of individual academics in business schools. And at the age of 30-something, he was already #2 in the list in terms of publications and seen as the rising whiz kid of German management science. He'd published 3 papers in our journal, and it was brought to our attention that I think he'd already in 10 years published 60 journal articles in good journals. In other words, he was publishing about 5 times the rate of the rest of us. It was pointed out that several of these involve overlapping contributions. The people who found this out, who chose to remain anonymous, brought this to us. The first journal they'd gone to had basically not wanted to get too involved. They brought it to us knowing we would be like a dog with a bone. We'd keep going until we had the answer. We investigated, very long, protracted process that has to be legally watertight. And at the end, we withdrew 2 of his papers because they had overlapping contributions, undeclared overlapping contributions with other papers. And also there were methodological problems to do with omitted variable bias, which is normally unintentional, but in his case was very much intentional and premeditated. So we retracted 2 papers, then other journals realized they had to do the same, and about 18 of his papers were retracted, at which point he lost his full chair in a leading German university. So this and other lesser events along the line, which often involve me writing what I call my magisterial letter to an author saying, you've been a naughty boy, because most of them are men, unfortunately. You've been a naughty boy. You surely will not want to obtain a reputation in the academic community for being involved in misconduct. So it's been very much part of what I and other journal editors have had to do over the last 10 or 15 years. Without wanting to, we've had to become, by default, the police of the academic world, because most other people are just not willing to spend the huge amounts of time and effort investigating these cases to draw a legally watertight conclusion to them.
Yeah, and then you around the year 2010, I think you become involved, well, with some reflective work regarding now the mapping of innovation studies, the fact that there are some special issues in research policy regarding the contribution of Chris or the contribution of Nick. You do a famous paper on the future developments of innovation studies and science policy. Maybe you could drop a word on that exercise, but just to flag, I will be adding towards the other very heavy managerial duties that you take on board, which is leading research policy. But before we go there, and perhaps we will end there and then end over to the next half of our experience here, what is this moment of reflexivity regarding this looking back and looking forward, and then we go to research policy as journal to be managed?
Yes. Well, that paper you're referring to on the history and evolution of our field was 5 or 6 years in the making, and I think began with a conference in Sprue, probably one of our anniversary conferences, where I was introducing, it may be Dick Nelson or some other eminent speaker, maybe Jim Atterbuck. And we got talking about what were the big contributions in the field. And I realized it was all very subjective. Everybody had their own list, but there was nothing systematic about this. So I then thought, well, surely we can be a bit more systematic about this. I began playing around in spare time after I stepped down as director of Sprue. But then the big opportunity to take this further came when Jan Fagerberg invited me to be part of his centre at the Norwegian Academy of Sciences, where I turned up, and I said to him, what do you expect from me as one of your team? And he said, well, if you write a paper, just put our address on it, and that's all. So that gave me the time and indeed encouragement from Jan and others there, like David Mowry, Bart Verspagen, Marianne Feldman, to look more thoroughly and systematically at the history and evolution of our field, to identify in a fairly systematic way what had been the big contributions, and to write that up in the form of that paper, which was quite interesting in showing how the field began to emerge as different disciplines bumped into each other, realizing they had a common interest in and around science, technology, and innovation policy. So the initial confrontations took place in the States between economists and sociologists, and specifically rural sociologists, who were looking at the effects of innovation in farming in the 1950s America. And they had big disputes about what was innovation and so on at their conferences. And then other fields began to join in, management, politics, and so on. And so it was fascinating in this history, seeing different fields begin to join into our field as it emerged as a separate field over time, but also noting some obvious omissions. So for much of the 70s and 80s, we had little or no interaction with our neighbours in science and technology studies, apart from in the Netherlands. There was little interaction with higher education policy, which is a different field, higher education studies. There was little interaction with applied psychology and creativity, which was one reason I ended up collaborating with Sven Hemlin and doing a couple of books on creative knowledge environments and so on. So this provided, I'd like to think, a more solid understanding of how our field had evolved, the contributions as different fields made contributions to it, how it had evolved over time, and any lessons one could draw from that. So that's the background to that work.
Excellent, and that's yet another field in which you became influential. And the more we talk, the more we are reminded of your other streams of work, like the creative knowledge environment, something that actually influenced me in my own work, practical work as a regulator some time ago. I have not told you that before, I think. But let me now, as we go to the last mile in our conversation here before we open to our other friends, because everybody is, I'm sure, waiting to listen about how is research policy managed. How do you do it at the helm of this aircraft carrier in this big fleet of innovation friendly journals today, because that's the leading, it's the flagship. It's under pressure because of too much success, too many submissions, maybe some AI powered, and you have to now deal with competition. In Sprue, you told us, Sprue was so good that the faced competition, people were being picked by other places. Research policy is also this sort of gold standard in the field. You have a plethora of other people in editorial roles. How is this responsibility of knowing that your editorial in chief decisions will steer the field in some way?
Okay, well, first of all, I've now stepped down as of January as coordinating editor, but I held that role for nearly 20 years. Research policy is essentially run by a collective. In other words, I and 12 other editors are all equal, and authors can choose which editor they submit to. In other words, it's a rather different structure to most journals, where papers go into one central place and are then distributed amongst the editors by somebody centrally. We've resisted that, partly because that was the organizational structure we inherited from Chris and Keith, with editors in Germany and in the US in the early years, and in France. In addition, I resisted it because I knew and Elsevier tried to push us towards a standard model, all the papers going to one central place. I knew that would end up with me at the center trying to decide how all these hundreds of papers were distributed. And I felt it was healthier to have this decentralized collective structure, because that then meant not only were authors free to choose which editor, and they would know different editors had different tastes, different areas of expertise. I also suspect they know that certain editors are tougher than others, which may come into play in some cases. And that as a result of that, you would get a greater diversity of papers than if you had the standard model with one managing editor at the center. And when over the years, I and others have asked at conferences and the like, people, what do they like about research policy? The response that they often say first is the unexpected papers you come across in it. That there's more diversity in research policy than in other similar journals. And that, I think, is because we have this collective structure rather than a centralized structure. So again, I've been very fortunate with some excellent editors over the years, the 20 years I've been involved in this. However, it is a bit of a nightmare to run, because ultimately you have to make decisions, and somehow or other we have to arrive at consensus across a dozen or so editors, not to mention half a dozen associate editors. So sometimes that can be a rather time-consuming task, but we have ways of trying to achieve that. So when we're making decisions on new editors or refreshing the advisory editor board, we manage to get there, even though it does involve a lot of work. So that's how we run. At the background in all of this is, and it's not unique to research policy, it's not unique to Elsevier, I think most journals are finding the same. There's a continuous struggle between editors and publishers. And over the 20 years that I've been involved, there's been a whole series of decisions which ultimately go the way of the publisher, because they call the shots. In our case, they own the title. So we can't walk away with the title. We can walk away collectively, as some journals have done. The editors have resigned, but the title stays with Elsevier. So there's lots of things which they've done where, and it's always phrased in this new way of doing things is being rolled out. In other words, you can't discuss it, argue against it, it's happening. And so that's going on in the background. There are things about journal publishers in general, not just Elsevier, that I feel uncomfortable with, but I have to be careful what I say in public, because in my contract it says if I do anything to bring the reputation of Elsevier into disrepute, they can end my contract. So there's that going on in the background as well. So it's It is a time-consuming task. Today is the task of coordinating editor, which we used informally. I resisted becoming known as managing editor or something, but the task of coordinating editor was taking up to about a day a week, which I've been contributing over the last 20 years.
Yes. So this is actually the only innovation-focused journal today in what for economists is and people in management is quite important, which is the FT Top 50 ranking. And of course, we have a proliferation of rankings as other institutions in science develop. So Ben, let me just make the transit to the second half, but not before. Thank you so much for this interaction. And once again, to tell you that I was very fortunate to have you as my supervisor, and that I always was full of admiration by your example and by the sheer joy of your company. And I'm sure I'm not alone in that. So we are always so happy to listen to you and to your ideas, many of which will still be on the table now, as I call on Diana Hicks, the famous Diana Hicks, to lead us into what she may think as some leading questions. Diana, if you prefer, you take a shot at one question, and then we move to Jeremy. But let me know how you prefer. I will be here to establish the context as Rajesh asked me. Is Diana able to move?
Fine. Okay,
Thank you.
Yeah, but I think, Sandro, that normally there's a short break here in case people want to take a comfort break for 2 or 3 minutes. I don't know, Rajesh or
Exactly. Exactly. That is customarily we have a 5 minutes break. If you find it appropriate, we can go for a break, or no problem in continuing. I think better we take a brief break. It's a 2-hour session. Yeah. Yeah. Let's break for it. Yeah, I think we can reconvene.
Yeah, that's right. If everybody is here, we can.
Very well. So thank you for being back. Wonderful to see again, Diana. And she's United States, I think. Over to you, Diana. Let us know what's in your mind regarding that.
Thank you. Nice to see you, Ben. Sorry about the time confusion. Okay, I'll start off with, well, I've always been impressed by your strong sense of values. And but in the workplace, we often run into situations that pressure us to compromise on things we believe are important. So have you run into such difficulties and times where it's been easier not to stand up for something you believed in was right? And how'd you handle it? And what do you recommend to today's young people if they're going to face something similar?
Right. I guess this is a product of a number of things. One, the way I was brought up in the 1950s, middle-class English family, father a bank manager. So a fairly conservative upbringing with emphasis on values, doing the right thing, and so on. So that's there in the background. Coming to Sprue, well, I'm heading towards an area where, and this goes back to the idealism of the students in the 1970s. We wanted to change the world and make it a better place. We weren't motivated by making money. We weren't necessarily motivated by becoming famous, but we were motivated by, you know, the world in the 1970s. We'd overcome world wars. We'd gone through a certain amount of economic growth. Now we wanted to make the world a better place. And that immediately takes you to values. And indeed, in the later stages of school and at university, I was reading widely, trying to find things that would influence me and shape my own personal philosophy of life, what I wanted to get out of life, and so on. So all that was going on. And as I say, I was then coming from a scientific background, very much of the view that science, technology, and innovation are a force for human good, but they do need well-developed policies and management strategies in companies. That's why I was ending up in science policy research. I had this vision of, I think it was Newton who said, give me a place where I can stand and I will move the world. So this is a long lever and Newton pulling on one end and moving the earth at the other end. So I thought science policy was the place to stand and shape the world and make it a better place. So that's, and then surrounded by people at Sprue with certain values, in particular openness. Chris Freeman exemplified this. If there was somebody in the room very junior, you made sure that they got a chance to speak and have their say, and you gave their views the same respect as from those from some eminent professor. So this was going on in Sprue, and you became imbued with it by attending both formal events like Friday afternoon seminars, but also in informal events where you bumped into people over coffee or tea in the tea break in the morning and the afternoon, or went to lunch with people and so on. So I was picking all that up along the way. When I came to be director of Sprue, I've mentioned some of the things I did, but I also read some of those big books at the time about management and leadership. One of them was called Pursuit of Excellence, which took a number of companies which had done well in recent years and tried to understand why they'd done well. As many of you will know, what happened a few years later down the road is many of those companies disappeared or went bankrupt or whatever. But one thing that did strike me at that time was this notion that what made for a successful company or an excellent company was a set of shared values. And so that drove home to me what I already believed was important about Sprue. The things that made Sprue more than the sum of its parts were the values that bound us together. So all of these things were pointing towards that. And subsequently, you know, I've tried to apply that and indeed taken opportunities at public occasions, lectures and conferences and so on to say something about values, because I realize this is not something that's widely discussed, certainly not written about in our field, but which is actually very important for the health and the vitality of our field, as well as institutions like SPRU. So that's where I'm coming from on all of this. No, clashes where I've had to compromise. Well, let me give me one example. About the second or third project we did was for the European Community, it was then called, before the European Union, and it was to evaluate their steel research laboratories. They had a number of steel labs in different countries, which they supported. And it was a very incestuous relationship between the directors of those labs and the decision makers in Brussels. They would have their meetings, and the secretary always remarked how it was remarkable that they always arrived quickly at consensus as to who would get what money. What he didn't know, but what one of us told us, was that the day before they would meet informally and decide how to carve up the cake. Anyway, we wrote an evaluation of this, which was quite critical about some of the things, some of the aspects of this problem, this situation. And of course, when word got out, the directors of the steel labs put pressure on the person who hired us at Brussels to suppress what we were saying. And although we had earlier got permission to publish an academic paper on that evaluation, we were told that permission was now withdrawn retrospectively. And if we went ahead and published, as we threatened to do, then SPRU and indeed the University of Sussex would not get another penny from the European Commission. And we reckoned, well, we couldn't hire as expensive solicitors as the Commission. So we backed down, and to my shame, we never published that paper. So occasionally, yes, I've compromised on my principles. And that one, you know, I have an undying shame about that, but there's nothing much we could do about it. There've been other cases where, again, you have to compromise, find a pragmatic way through things. But I think you still need a full discussion and analysis of the principles you're trying to uphold, even if ultimately you have to sacrifice some of them.
Not sure, Diana, if you want to follow up, or we can go to Jeremy.
Sure.
Yes, Jeremy.
Thank you very much, Sandro, and Ben, you as well. Also, Diana, it's really nice to see you. It's been ages. For those in the room, Diana was actually our course convener for our PhD program, so I've learned an enormous amount that I still remember to this day. So it was really, really great to see that you're going to be involved in this. So thanks for all those years. I actually used to work for Ben many years ago around the same time too, so it's a bit strange for me to be in this room 25 years later, but it's really great to be here. Anyway, this does relate to my question. During your career, Ben, the UK academic system has undergone huge changes, both in terms of growth and organizational structuring, which in turn has been considered elsewhere. So I just got back from Pakistan, and they were planning to adopt the RAF, the TAF, and the CAF. And I'm sure other countries are looking very closely at what we're doing here. So my questions are, what do you think are the major challenges facing academics, especially the young career researchers? That's something that worries me most of all about these changes. They're happening at such a rapid pace that the advice I've given some people a few years ago have become obsolete already. And on the flip side, I want to know, what do you think the opportunities are? I don't want to just dwell on the challenges. I think we spend as academics a lot of time on that, but what are the actual opportunities for junior researchers in particular?
Right. Yes, the academic world has changed very considerably in the 40-odd years that I've been working in it. When I came into academia in 1978 as a fellow at SPRU, the pressures on you were very, very considerably less than they are today. So to take one example, that first big important paper coming out of the big science project was 5 years later in 1983. The people who'd hired us, Keith Pavitt, Chris Freeman, Marie Hoder, knew that work was about to come out, but they didn't pressurize us to publish from the very start, whereas people joining an academic organization today are expected to churn out, 2 good journal articles a year from the very start. That wasn't the case back then. There was a lot less intensive pressure. There was less by way of departmental strategies. There was nothing by the way of, virtually nothing by way of university league tables. All those are now very, very prominent. And here I have to put up my hand and admit to a feeling of some guilt, because John Irvin and I were part of the pioneers developing techniques for assessing science, techniques which have now initially were resisted by the academic community, but now many have gone overboard, adopted them, forgotten all the caveats which we were at pains to stress 40 odd years ago, applied them willy-nilly and assumed that's the answer to everything. And that in turn puts, in my view, unfair, extreme pressure on younger career researchers to produce and to have an impact. Some things just take time. As I say, that first paper was several years in the making, and I still regard it as one of the best ones. But these days, a young researcher newly joining SPRU would not be given 5 years to produce that first good paper. So there are these pressures, and I feel partly guilty that I was part of the process for setting in motion these formal assessment procedures, which are now being used, if not abused, by heads of department, senior managers and university and so on, intent on maximizing their score in whatever game's being played, whether it's international league tables of universities or the research assessment exercises in the UK, now called Research Excellence Framework, and so on. So I do feel we've taken some things too far. And indeed here, that brings us on to a wider lesson, if you like, that policies and approaches which we suggested in the past, which were needed when things were a lot laxer, shall we say, may be good up to a certain point, but that does not imply that more of them and more is better. There's some optimum point for levels of evaluation and accountability and value for money. And if taken too far, you get adverse consequences, often unintended. And one of the unintended consequences of this more pressurized system today, I suspect, is people running out of time who then try to cut corners with their research, with their papers, and then in some cases at least get caught up in misconduct investigations.
So if I may just quickly follow up with the opportunities for junior scholars, what sort of advice would you give them under this dynamic environment that we operate under?
Well, I've given that some thought, not least after being prompted by some of you as we discussed this beforehand. So a revised version of the bio that I prepared for this now ends up with some lessons for younger researchers. One of which is be bold. Don't do the same as your supervisor did in more detail and greater depth. Find something new, but that immediately means that you'll run the risk of being beaten up when you send your papers into journals, particularly if they're leading journals, by referees who say that's not the standard way of doing things, or this is an area that we're not quite sure we should be looking at, or looking at it in this way. But that's the first piece of advice. Be bold. Find something new and important for policy purposes or management purposes. For me, that's key. There are some in our field now who are more concerned with the field becoming more academic, more theoretical. And for them, they're driven more by the paradigm, if you like, the emerging paradigm for our field, rather than by real world problems. So I do believe that it is important in your area to be out there talking informally to key decision makers in government, industry and elsewhere about their problems, and in particular, although they find this harder, what they think will be the big problems on their desk in 3 or 5 years' time, which you can then do some research on so that you're well placed to help them in 3 or 5 years when that problem becomes more pronounced. So being close to the ground in terms of your users, to use the jargon, decision makers in government and industry in the case of science policy and innovation studies, so that you're all the time snuffing out new areas. If you look at my career, I've moved several times as the problems have changed, and or if I've begun to lose interest in a field because I think the interesting, more basic research has been done and it's time to move on. So being attuned with the changing world in which we live and the problems that you can address, I think, is another key part of the advice I would offer. Then the last one would be collaborate. You can't do this is not a solo activity. It was perhaps 50 years ago. Dick Nelson could write papers on his own. Now you have to collaborate, typically in teams of 3, 4, 5. Collaborate, find out who's working on similar themes, perhaps in another country. Collaborate with them. Make your national study into an international comparison, and it will be that much more significant when it comes to judging its potential contribution when you submit it to a journal.
Thank you. I'm going to hand it over to Paul now, if that's okay.
Thank you, Ben. And again, lovely to see you, Diana. Lovely to see you, Sid, and everyone. That's beautifully segues into my question, which is exactly on this topic of what a contribution is. So, Ben, you've been an editor of a major international journal for a very long time, and a lot of papers, particularly for junior scholars, get rejected because the contribution isn't clear or the contribution isn't significant enough. And that seems to be kind of part of the kind of hidden curricula where if you know it, you know it. And if you don't know it, you don't know how to respond to that. Could you draw on your experience and just give us a kind of a layman's kind of guide to what makes a paper significant enough that the contribution is big enough to publish? What does that mean?
Right. And this is, again, another aspect in which the life of the early career researcher is infinitely harder than it was 40 years ago. 40 years ago, there was lots of virgin territory out there to be explored, and it was not very difficult to find something which would then be seen as a contribution. Now we've had 40 or 50 years of work by thousands of scholars on science policy and innovation around the world. So the territory has been fairly thoroughly explored. So when a paper comes into a journal like Research Policy, we're looking first of all in terms of scope and whether it fits within the scope of our journal. And that's fairly easy to ascertain by looking at the web pages, the keywords, talking to experienced authors and so on. But we're also looking at the quality, and that means, does this paper at least potentially make a significant contribution to our knowledge, as would be seen by the broad variety of research policy readers? To answer that to the satisfaction of the handling editor when he gets your paper, you have to make sure that your study is, and this is the phrasing that I often use in letters of rejection, is appropriately embedded in the relevant literature and uses that relevant literature to motivate your study. In other words, using the existing literature to identify a gap, and not just any old gap. You have to show it's an important gap, an interesting gap, an important one. To do that, that involves looking at previous public articles, and ideally finding some that have been very influential, which in the last page or two, when they come to limitations of the study and future work, says, well, wouldn't it be nice if we knew this or we did that? If you can then use that as a hook for your paper, ideally with previous publications in that same journal, then it's very difficult for the handling editor to put your paper in the desk reject pile as opposed to, oh, I better find some referees to send this out for review. So that is essentially how I interpret it. And indeed, for the last 10 or 15 years, that's how I've gone around the world telling people in meet the editor sessions to do it. But again, that I think possibly has a downside, because I'm now beginning to feel we get a very homogeneous set of papers who follow this routine to the letter, as opposed to finding something entirely new where that approach may not work, something that's conceptually very new, where there isn't much relevant literature, and what there is contradictory or whatever. It's a lot harder if you're going in pursuit of something new. So this, what I've described in terms of a contribution, runs counter to what I said earlier about doing something new. So there is a tension there to be resolved. And where you go as an individual depends on your own risk aversion or risk preparedness to take risks as an individual. So if you're prepared to take risks, then the bolder you'll be, the more you get beaten up by referees, and the more you'll shrug it off, learn from that, and move on. But for some younger researchers, they take this too personally, think it's just them that's at fault, give up, and perhaps stop being an academic, which often is a great shame. And I should say at that point, there's probably a gender dimension to that, unfortunately or not, and which is why I've spent a significant amount of time in recent years mentoring younger women to be more self-confident, so that when they get the setbacks that all of us get, you know, men will say, well, it wasn't my fault. Yeah, the editor picked the wrong referees and the referees were ignorant. The women will tend to say, what did I do wrong? I'm generalizing here, but anyway, I've devoted certain effort to trying to encourage everybody, women and men, to go through this pain barrier, as it were, which we all go through. And so many of my papers have been rejected, particularly earlier in the career, but also later in the career. These are inevitable, and you just have to find a way through that and learn from it.
All right, thank you very much, Ben. I'm going to hand over, I think, to Diana.
Thank you, Paul. Yeah, it's great to be with you guys again. Yeah, I'm going to deviate a little from the previous questions, because this thing about the pressures on young people has got me thinking about one of the big changes I've seen, and I don't know if you're seeing it over there, is this people trying to shift from the traditional PhD thesis to the 3-paper thing. And you know, maybe I'm just old, but I just think that's I don't like it. But what do you think, Ben?
I have mixed views, but I think ultimately the student should have the choice. And if a doctoral student is clear that they want to be an academic, then that it is probably the case, whether we like it or not, that they will be better served by a thesis on the basis of papers rather than a monograph. But a thesis by papers does bring problems. You have to have, and it is normally 3 papers, which are sufficiently related to make up a thesis, but which are sufficiently distinct that when they go to journals, typically 3 different journals, the journals will not feel that these are overlapping contributions that then jeopardize the chances of the paper that's submitted to that particular journal. And what I do strongly advise doctoral students in this position to do is, when submitting one of those 3 papers to a journal, to tell in a covering letter the editor the full story. There are 2 other papers that are related, but they are different in the following respects. And if you, the editor, want to see them, to see if the contributions overlap, you're free to do so. What I object to is students who send in their paper with no covering note, and we then subsequently discover, often by accident, perhaps through a referee, that there are 2 other papers with closely related subject matter, same database maybe same approach, and potentially an overlapping contribution that we were not told about. And then I can get quite stroppy with the author for not briefing us on that. If they brief us early on, normally the editor will work with that student to ensure that you have a clear differentiation of product between that paper and the other 2. But if we are not informed about it and we found out later, we get justifiably, I think, angry about this and say you potentially misled us about whether this contribution is unique or whether it's partly covered in another paper.
Yeah, it seems to crystallize for me this, what you talked about. You had like 5 years to do that first paper.
Yes.
And so taking away the traditional thesis time, substituting it with yet more papers, you're right, you do it because of the exigencies of the demands of the market, that from, the moment you start in research, you have to produce 2 papers a year, and you give up the chance to explore anything in depth. It's like the last place you would possibly have that time, but even that has been subjugated to this publication pressure. So that seems to be the loss to me, that there's just never any time in a career to explore
Yes.
something in depth.
I
Maybe
think
at the
you're
end,
right
but by
that
that time you're so enculturated into the pushing out 2 papers a year that you don't even know how to do it.
I think you're right that for those of us of older generations, the luxuries, it would now be seen, of being able to spend 3 or 4 years on a single study and doing it to death, following up all the loose ends wherever they might take you, that's now gone. And instead you have a more pragmatic but faster pace that means you miss out on some of the things that we learnt along the way serendipitously, given we had the luxury of that greater amount of time.
Yes, maybe Jeremy, you want to carry
Yes,
on with the
thank
circle?
you. So my question relates to the Global South, particularly research that's been conducted there over the years. My observations has been that there's been remarkable progress. I was a journal editor for 10 years, and when we were getting submissions from, for example, China 10 years ago, the quality was very poor. And by the time I finished, it was excellent quality. It was shocking that in such a short period of time, how much better the research became. I speculate this has been facilitated by, for example, better technology, so they can get access to publications that were very expensive in the past. They have vastly improved English language capabilities, which I didn't have before. The other thing is that the return of high quality foreign trained scholars have gone back home. This is something I'm seeing in a regular pattern, including some in this room, some of which were trained by you. And Diana, I'm not including you in that mix because, coming from the States, being trained in England and then going back to the US isn't quite what I'm talking about when it comes to the Global South, even though you are located more in the south of the US. But those sort of dynamics that's emerging, I'm stunned actually when I go internationally or they come and visit us, about the quality of the PhD students that I'm now seeing that I never used to see before. So my question relates to this, is that what advice do you have for those next generation domestically trained scholars in the Global South? So your students that have gone back are now training a generation of PhD students. What advice do you give them in this world, this academic world that we're now evolving into?
Well, let me preface that by saying that one thing that has been attractive about Sprue from the start is how international it has always been. And back in the 60s, early 70s, that was unusual, but we were getting visitors from all around the world. We were getting doctoral students from all around the world. So visitors from China, from India, from Brazil. I was fortunate, one of my earliest doctoral students was a Brazilian. So we took it for granted, as it were, that the nature of our work was truly international, including the South. One of those 5 groups in Sprue in the early years was the so-called Developing Countries Group with Charles Cooper, Martin Bell, Jeff Oldham and others. And that was very prominent internationally. And they brought in individuals, helped those individuals acquire knowledge and skills. Some of them went back, set up their own institutes, and that then helped propagate the ideas, the knowledge, the expertise in those countries. So that's always been there for me. And as I say, one of the attractive aspects of Sprue, because in the 60s and 70s, most British university departments did not have that degree of international integration. Bringing it up to today, yes, it is a lot easier now for aspiring scholars in Latin America, Africa, Southern Asia, Southeast Asia, to quickly get up to speed with the forefront of a field, the exciting topics. Much of this can be done online. And at least during COVID, and this may be when we look back in 10 or 15 years' time at the COVID era, we'll see that although it was a horrendous time for many of us, people of my age were actually, literally in fear of our lives that we might be the next ones to go. One of the good things that came out of this was a realization that a lot of what we had done previously face-to-face, including international conferences, could be done less satisfactorily, but could be done in part through digital means. So in recent years, as I've partly for environmental reasons, partly for family reasons, traveled less, I've still been able to participate in activities around the world and seen other younger researchers from the South take part in some of those events, if not in face-to-face, then at least online, getting at least some of the benefits, even if you don't get all the benefits that you do when you're face-to-face. So I think that is one bit of advice. Make sure you have an early warning system of key events, particularly events that you can participate in at probably zero cost through digital means. The second piece of advice I've hinted at earlier, which is if you are working, let's say you're working in Vietnam on a particular study of nanotechnology in Vietnam, find some other early career researchers looking at nanotechnology in other southern countries, or indeed in developed northern countries, and see whether you can collaborate with them. And as I say, turn your national study into perhaps a 3 or 4 country study with international comparisons and a bigger potential contribution. All of this can be made a lot easier and cheaper and more efficient through the digital world in which we now live.
Thank you, Ben. Over to you, Paul.
Ben, can I kind of ask you about the trade-offs involved in some of the shifts that you're kind of talking about? So one of the things you've kind of highlighted in your work is the growth of kind of science funding has meant that it's now a very significant bit of government spending, and in a democracy there is a need for oversight, and that oversight will have costs. And it does seem that, if you're spending huge amounts of money, then the taxpayer has a right to look for kind of, are they getting value for money? So the oversight work that you've done in that way has contributed towards that need. But you have said that, that sometimes it's kind of gone too far. And it's also that increase in spending has aligned with a kind of a shift from an ethics of discovery, where people had a lot of time, it wasn't very expensive, and they could come up with the right answer, towards a kind of an ethic of innovation, where there's much more focus on impacts because science is becoming more important. So I think, when I started at Sprue, yogurt was yogurt. Now yogurt is high tech. Low tech industries are very science intensive. Given that kind of shift, how should policymakers manage those trade-offs? Because they seem, it seems almost as if the debate is, as academics, we'd really like to live in a world where we didn't have oversight, but we quite like this new world where we get loads of money. How should policymakers deal with that?
Right. Well, first of all, I'm very conscious of the fact that money for science, technology, and innovation has to be weighed in the balance against government money for other activities. I mentioned earlier on, my wife worked in the National Health Service in the UK. So she'd come home in the evening saying, we need more money, otherwise our patients are dying. I'd come home saying, we need more money. Otherwise, well, researchers don't get their project funded. How do you weigh that up in the balance? So somebody somewhere has to make that decision. During the late 90s, early 2000s, there was a lot of attention given to the notion of evidence-based policy. by analogy with evidence-based medicine. But I was always a bit leery of that because I'm not sure that one could translate evidence-based medicine into evidence-based policy so easily. The implication was if you came up with enough good evidence, that would solve the problems, but it doesn't. Ultimately, somewhere is faced with the task of comparing apples with oranges, with health service spending, with science spending. And that's a political decision made by politicians with ideological interests, constituency interests, sometimes other interests which they shouldn't have. And so it's a very messy game that's played somewhere. All that we can do is that make sure we are presenting as convincing a case as possible. So that's what I've seen my role as being. That means, sometimes we will not be successful. In the UK, unfortunately, it's not often the case that in the run-up to election, spending on science, technology, and innovation is one of the topics that's discussed. I suspect that's going to be the case over the next 6 months before our next election. I don't know in the US whether there's any discussion of this in the States, but I suspect not. So there is a big problem there. And again, one has to be alert for opportunities where you may suddenly get a chance to have an impact. So one of these I've hinted at along the way was work I did for a Royal Society group in a year before an election, which was very explicitly trying to make the best possible case for funding of science. I think it was called The Fruits of Curiosity. It's important these reports have a catchy title. This was called The Fruits of Curiosity. It was mainly eminent scientists like Paul Nurse, but there were one or two of us who were science policy people, and we tried to construct a case that would be attractive to the winners of the next election. And in that we had some success. We learned subsequently that in the tough discussions between the Treasury and the Prime Minister, suddenly the Treasury found they had a few extra 100 million, and somebody produced the Fruits of Curiosity report, and that went down well. So suddenly a few 100 million extra was found for the science vote for British spending on science. But that was an opportunity that we deliberately took advantage of. I've often said that what we do in the policy world is a bit like surfing. You're looking for the big wave coming from behind you that you can get upright on and surf and make a significant impact. A lot of the time, the sea will be flat or the waves are not suitable or whatever, and you're just paddling around, not having much impact. So looking to see when is the right opportunity to convey a particular message is, I think, part of the secret of any success you might have as a policy researcher.
Many thanks. I think I hand over to Sandro.
Well, and thank you so much, Paul. I was about to ask if Diana has one last question from our side in our panel before I think myself I bring in questions from the audience. Diana.
No, let's go to the audience questions.
All right.
I had one about what was a good conference, and my answer to that would be let the audience speak.
Yeah, that was one of the questions. Okay, there we go.
But if you want to elaborate, because we have just enough time, if you want to drop one more comment on the conference dynamics, Ben, even because there are conferences and conferences. Some are academic, some are broad, some are focused, some are policy oriented, like that one in OECD in which you made an impact. If you want to tell us about the role of being with other people in these academic settings that are temporary in this virtual world.
Well, now I'm conscious of the clock, but my point here is that I get frustrated at conferences where there's not enough time for the audience to participate. So I think turn it over to the online questions now.
Very well. So we don't have many, but we have just one here, just asking you, well, over the course of your career, Ben, we have lived through a major technological revolution, the digital connectivity, the computing revolution. impacting on society, on labor markets, politics. How do you think this timing has influenced your thinking and experience? How do you think it would have been different in a different era, like the 50s or 60s? So living in the revolutionary time.
It's had a profound influence in a number of ways. Let me give you one example. When I stepped down as director of SPRU, as I said, I had a sabbatical essentially for a year, went and read in the library, something I'd not done for many years, but also began to realize that my old approaches to research, sitting in libraries, reading journals and articles, had been overtaken by IT, and that a lot of what one did now was sitting at a computer with databases and with preprints and electronic versions of papers rather than going to libraries. So I had to learn a new research approach attuned to or taking advantage of IT. What IT has done is link things together all around the world, making things more complicated, more difficult to analyze and understand, let alone forecast and control. It's also speeded things up. We were touching on that earlier with the pressures that it's brought to bear on researchers who are now meant to be, quote, more efficient and make sure they use that time that's set aside for research efficiently in producing 2 papers a year or whatever it is. So some of the downsides of IT are things we should be concerned about. And indeed, going back to the 1980s, when Chris and others began to analyze what was happening in what was then called microcomputing. It wasn't called IT, it was called microelectronics, I think it was. They did try and think what would be the downsides as well as the positive benefits of these changes. So again, I think that's an important characteristic of SPRU and work in the area. We should be thinking not only about what new technologies bring in the form of benefits, but also what are the potential unintended consequences that should be borne in balance when deciding whether to go one route or another. And this is where the work of Andy Sterling and colleagues on directionality comes in. There's not one route that new technology is going to follow ineluctably. The decisions we make or decision makers make affect which trajectory we follow. And so we have an element of choice that we should make sure is exercised effectively. So those are some of the things that would come into play here. Have I answered the question? I'm looking again.
Yes. So I should thank Matthew Lockwood for this question. Now I have 2 tiny questions, and I will end this moment by asking if people want to open their mic to direct in voice some question for you, because you have many of your friends online right now, actually.
I'm sorry, Sandro. There's just one more question in the chat. I don't know if you got it.
Yeah,
it was
in the chat
very early in the beginning.
There is one question about the fact that the computing power and the availability of data is so big today that in fact this excess of technique may obscure our understanding of dynamics of innovation and the distributional implications of innovation. Are we becoming too technical and forgetting about the political economy of it all?
Yes. And indeed, I've thought of another bit of the response to the previous question, which let me put in at this point. The effect of IT is that we can now be a lot more effective in our searching for relevant papers when doing the literature review for our study and for the paper. With suitable choice of 4 or 5 keywords, I can find anything that's been published on a particular topic. Back in the 80s and 70s, it wasn't like that. You built up a list of interesting looking references. You went toddling off to the library. You found the relevant book or published journal. And in going through that, you found other articles which you hadn't thought about, which actually showed you a new perspective on a particular problem, took you off an entirely new direction. So one consequence of IT is a tendency to go narrower and deeper rather than get the advantages of breadth, which we got in the good old days or the bad old days, however you want to describe them. Well, that's another consequence. And I see that very obviously now, younger career researchers, all the pressures on them go narrow and deep. And yet often the big advances come when you go broader and find a different perspective, a different methodology, a different theoretical framework or whatever, which you lose through this IT approach. But coming to this one, yes, obsession with large data. A couple of things here. One, for several years, I've been warning against what can be characterized as the drunk looking for the keys under the lamppost problem. Most of you will be familiar with this joke. A policeman spots somebody who's obviously very drunk late at night looking underneath a lamppost for something. The policeman says, "What are you doing?" The drunk says, "I'm looking for my car keys." The policeman says, "Are you sure you dropped them there?" And the drunk says, "No, but this is where the light is." Many in the academic community today, now that we have lots of data out there, already existing data, start with that rather than with the problem. And they don't get to see some of the problems with that data that was probably developed for entirely different purposes, with lots of hidden assumptions, maybe misleading in certain respects, but that's where the big data is, and they can then apply sophisticated statistical techniques, very fancy statistics, and come up proving that things are, verified at the 1% reliability level or whatever, but not really thinking what the data actually mean. So there is a danger there. And more recently, we've had all this hype about big data. Suddenly the databases that are available are much, much larger. And my worry is that people go off to these thinking that they can write big papers without really understanding what those data mean, whether they can be used for that particular purpose. So in other words, they're not doing all the conceptual analysis that we were doing with bibliometric indicators 40 years ago before we started to try and apply them in a tentative way.
Very well. So from our big international audience, we have two shots here. One fired by Sylvan Katz, asking if you have thought about the impact of AI on research evaluation and the formulation of research questions, and by Mark Dorchin, if many things follow the money, will research on innovation follow business schools?
Yes. Yeah. Okay, well, let's take Sylvan's question first. Yes, particularly we, the editors of research policy, have begun to discuss and get rather worried about the impact of AI on research. AI, in my view, has come on fantastically in the last 12 or 18 months. I remember you, Sandro, about 18 months ago, asked AI who was Ben Martin, and it said, well, I was a professor at SPRU, but I was also a professor of chemistry in Sweden and a professor of something else in the United States. In other words, it couldn't disentangle me from the other Ben Martins in this field. Now it can. And it's become a lot more sophisticated. Mark Dodson, who's asking the next question, showed me recently you can ask AI to do your literature review on a particular field, and it will come up with something that's got 50 or 60% of it right, and at least gives you a starting point for working out where you should be looking and so on. So we are worried that authors, particularly the less scrupulous authors, may begin to use AI in more devious ways. At present, we have just two simple rules as editors. One, you must declare any use of AI that you have made in your paper. And two, this does not absolve you of any responsibility. So if that AI accidentally introduces some plagiarized text, it's not the AI's fault, it's you, the author's fault. But we are aware this is a very fast-moving area. And before too long, if not already, and I know Paul feels he's getting some papers that show a bigger influence of AI, you will get papers where AI has been, well, almost one of the authors in doing a lot of the data analysis and so on, as well as perhaps embedding this in the literature. And then what do we do as editors in terms of, whether this is a contribution by the authors or a contribution by somebody who's particularly effective at using the latest version of AI? So there's a whole host of questions there for which we don't have answers, but we are certainly discussing it.
Most excellent. Maybe just before we close, if there are any questions from the audience, live questions, we have just a couple of minutes for that.
I can see Mark Dodgson's question about going where the money is.
Yes, that's a business school question. That's
a blunt way of saying what Spru's done for the last 50 or 60 years. It's one reason why we're still here today. We've gone where the money is. Occasionally that means giving up whole areas. I remember early in the 80s, up till then Spru had had some presence in environmental policy. Pauline Marstrand was leading a small group there. Suddenly under Mrs. Thatcher, no money for environmental policy. So that group disbanded and Spru moved on to other areas. Environmental policy obviously came back with a bang 20 years later, but that's part of what we do. But you're right, it does bring certain dangers. And indeed, dangers are being captured if you get too close to influential policymakers. There's a delicate balancing act here, which I've hinted at earlier, in terms of tailorizing your results of your work so that they're likely to have some resonance with key decision makers, let's say with a right of centre government. But you can't go too far because otherwise you end up losing your integrity, your objectivity as an academic. What's the balance there? I know just one thing. Everybody thinks they've got the balance right, and some people over there have gone glib and the others are stuck in an ivory tower and not engaging. But there's no hard and fast rules on this. It's something that has to be discussed and ironed out within your team with others and come up with something that you're happy with, basically, and can be defended in public if challenged.
Very well. Rajesh, Abiodun, I think we are over from this side. Thank you for the opportunity.
Right. Thank you. Thank you so very much. It's been a very interesting engagement, really. And this is one of the engagements that we think should not end. But unfortunately, we're going to have to stop at a point. And we're hoping that we would have another distinguished panel like this sometime soon. And that if we call on any of you, you will be happy to return and share from your wealth of experience with us. We'll draw the curtain here now, but before I do that, I'll hand back to Rajesh for any last-minute announcements that he may have. Thank you very much.
Nothing much. Thank you so much. This has been a wonderful conversation, well moderated and well handled. We all enjoyed. Thank you very much. We are yet to decide on our next event. We will let you all through email. So until then, good night, good evening, whatever from whichever time zones you are. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's been
all right. Thank you all. Have a nice morning, afternoon, or evening.